Hello, cooking enthusiasts. We are finally back with a recipe video, and today we are going to discuss my version of focaccia bread. Now, you might be familiar with focaccia bread. You may have even made it before. It's probably one of the more simple breads to make, and I may have made it slightly more complicated, just maybe. But despite some additions I've made to this procedure, it's all toward what I would define as creating an ideal focaccia. Obviously, focaccia has a very distinct shape. It can be quite tall and fluffy, but the height is definitely the shortest dimension, and it obviously can't be too thin. It's a basic bread dough with only the slight addition of olive oil for enrichment, a small amount in the dough, and a generous amount on the outside. But for me, the main characteristic is that while it is slightly crusty on the outside and slightly chewy, the primary characteristic is softness and fluffiness. So, within bread making, one variable that can increase fluffiness is to increase the hydration of the dough. That is, of course, the ratio of flour to water. The problem is, as hydration goes up, it's also a lot harder to work with. Now, it is a complicated recipe, but I at least wanted it to be somewhat user-friendly. So I decided to borrow a technique called Tangzhong, which you may have seen in recipes for something like Japanese milk bread. You essentially take a small amount of flour and some of the liquid in a recipe and pre-hydrate it using heat. This kind of technique might also be familiar to you if you've ever made cream puffs before. But essentially, what it lets you do is create a very high hydration dough that behaves more like a low hydration dough. So, my recipe is roughly 83% hydration. Again, people have made plenty of doughs that are even higher in hydration, but I'm trying to find a good middle ground. My basic recipe is 600 grams of white flour, 500 grams or mils of water, a tablespoon or roughly 10 grams of sugar, some baker's yeast, about a heaped teaspoon, 12 grams of salt, and roughly 50 grams of olive oil for inside the dough. Again, I like a little bit of chewiness, so I tend to go for 200 grams of bread flour and 400 grams of all-purpose, but you could easily adjust that ratio or go for entirely all-purpose flour if you like. First, I recommend measuring all of your ingredients. Once you have your water, you can split it roughly in half. Half of the water should be combined with your yeast and sugar, and the other half should be combined with 100 grams of your already measured all-purpose flour. Now it's time for that Tangzhong technique where you heat up your flour and water slurry. Most recipes I saw said to do this on the stove, but personally I prefer the microwave. Thoroughly combine that flour and water first, and take a note of the thickness. You want to microwave the mixture for 30 or 45-second bursts and thoroughly stir it in between microwaves. Keep doing that until the mixture is very hot and pretty significantly thickened. I usually ended up with a mixture that was close to the consistency of mashed potatoes. Once you have this starch paste, you need to let it cool down for a little bit, but I wouldn't make it too far in advance. Hopefully, by the time that's all ready, your yeast has bloomed a bit. Once you think that's ready, you can combine the yeast water with your starch paste and the remaining flour, as well as the 50 grams of olive oil. You then want to bring that all together until it's just combined, either in a regular bowl or in the bowl of your stand mixer on low speed. Once it is mostly combined, you want to let the entire mixture rest for 30 minutes up to an hour to start hydrating. After that rest, you want to add your 12 grams of salt and give it a good knead. Knead for 6 to 8 minutes by hand with a lightly oiled pans and work surface, or knead on medium speed in your stand mixer for 3 to 5 minutes. Despite the Tangzhong technique, it might still seem a little bit wet and sticky, but work quickly to form it into a ball and get it coated in a decent amount of olive oil in your bowl. I then recommend letting it rise overnight in the fridge for close to 24 hours. The next day, you want to punch down your dough and let it do a second rise at room temperature. For that classic focaccia shape, you want to spread the dough relatively thin onto a parchment and oiled tray. For a very neat looking focaccia, pick a relatively large baking tray that still has a decent amount of height on the edges. Put a little more oil on top and cover your dough loosely with plastic wrap and a tea towel. You need to let it rise again for between 4 and 8 more hours, depending on your room temperature. Once you are ready to bake, preheat your oven to 425 Fahrenheit or 220 Celsius. Once that's ready, create that classic look by pushing down into the dough with your fingertips to make a grid of indentations. At this stage, there's a number of additional ingredients and toppings you could put on top of your focaccia, But here's where I get a little bit funky. On the show Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, they showed a focaccia recipe where you pour salt water directly over top of the dough right before it bakes. This gives the exterior extra seasoning and creates a crispy crust as the water boils and generates steam. You are welcome to try this, but what I did is use some leftover brine from a fermentation project. The results were similar to the salt water, but they added some additional flavors and a little bit of tanginess. Either way, you want to bake your focaccia for 20 to 25 minutes. It should look pretty good on the outside, but one way to make sure is to take an internal temperature. The inside of the bread should be at least 88 Celsius or 190 Fahrenheit. And that's it. This is easily the best focaccia and one of the best breads I've ever made. If you want to try a version of this recipe, please let me know how it goes. If you have any questions about the recipe, please leave them in the comments. Otherwise, thank you for watching.